Award-winning Yellowstone Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey features a hand-picked blend of 4- and 7-year-old bourbons for an exclusive old-fashioned whiskey that honors its deep family origins. Yellowstone Bourbon borrows its moniker from America's very first national park. In 1872, Yellowstone Bourbon was crafted to honor the park's sprawling historic wonder and pioneering spirit. To further do their part, they donated a portion of Yellowstone Bourbon proceeds to the National Parks Conservation Association, NPCA, an organization devoted to nurturing our country's national parks for future generations. There's a bit of art and science in every bottle of bourbon, and maybe a little magic too. Here's how they blend it all at Limestone Branch. It all begins with the mash bill, the basic recipe for the bourbon. Yellowstone uses an open pollinated white heirloom corn, which makes for a slightly lighter whiskey flavor. Corn accounts for 75% of the grain bill, with 13% rye and 12% malted barley. A recipe, not so incidentally, that came from Stephen and Paul Beam's grandfather's notes. There's no pressure cooking at Limestone, just an old-fashioned open cook, starting at 200 degrees plus, to break down the starches of the corn. Many larger distilleries cook all the grain at one time, but Limestone Branch takes a 3-stage temperature cook. After the corn, they lower the temperature and the rye, and ultimately lower the temperature again to add the malted barley. After the cook, it's time to lower the temperature and pitch the yeast. And here's where a little magic comes in. Their yeast is a strain used by Stephen and Paul's great-grandfather and grandfather, reclaimed through DNA from a yeast jug that was on display in the Oscar Geets Whiskey Museum in Bardstown, Kentucky. The strain goes back to ancestors Guy Beam and Minor Case, and probably a lot further. Once the yeast is pitched and fermentation begins, it will continue for roughly 72 hours and produce what is called distiller's beer at about 8 to 10% alcohol. The distiller's beer then heads into the 600-gallon pot still for a stripping run, turning the beer into 250 gallons of what is now called low wine at 25 to 30% alcohol. The low wine then goes into a traditional alembic still to boil off volatile compounds. The heart is ultimately what is collected to go into barrels, now as close to 100 proof as possible. By then, 600 gallons of water and 950 pounds of grain have turned into one 53-gallon barrel of whiskey. All that remains is to actually transfer it into newly charred oak barrels to begin the aging process. From notes of rye to a smoky oak finish, Yellowstone Bourbon is truly a delicate fusion of flavors.